Hello, everyone. We were just having a chat, so you never know what you might have picked up. It's Daniel Finkelstein here from Onward and also The Times. And obviously, I'm here with Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives. We were obviously just about to share with you all sorts of personal information, which you will now miss out on. But Douglas, I want to start here. Your speech was sort of telling the rest of us that you worry we've given up on the union. So I want you to unpack that for me a bit and explain to me what it is we're all doing wrong.
Well, I think some people are falling into the SNP narrative that independence is inevitable, and they look at some opinion polls that suggest there has been the last 3 or 4 polls showing support for independence, but don't look further at the arguments. They don't look at the arguments and the opinion polls that say about 1 in 5 actually think the whole constitutional argument should be at the forefront of Scottish politics just now as we deal with a global pandemic, or the fact that we should be focused on education, on the health service, on the economy, on jobs. And I also want to just put down a marker that I think this government and previous governments have been guilty in the past of devolving and forgetting. You know, thinking, well, if we put the Barnett funding up to Holyrood, we've done our job. But Scotland has 2 governments, and I think people want to see both governments working together. And I think we've missed some opportunities to show the impact the UK government has in Scotland. And sorry, I was just going to say, the speech was supposed to be a bit of a wake-up call, and for people to reflect on, have they done enough to support the union, to strengthen the union, or could they do more? And that's really the aim of the speech.
One of my friends who's been very involved in the union campaign was very impressed by what you had to say, and I shared his view. It was very powerful, but I wasn't quite sure I knew what it. I mean, if you might give us an example of a way in which we could support, because I mean, David Cameron always had this view: if I go up to Scotland, I'll make things worse, and so he was kind of nervous that anything he did would be the wrong thing. I think Tony Blair was nervous about that too. So what can all of us do that would be helpful to the union, that show our support for the union, but would be, wouldn't run the risk of being the wrong thing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say, Tony Blair had those concerns, because I make the point, it has been successive UK governments since the Scotland Act in 1997 and devolution in 1999. I think there has been this impression to then leave things to Holyrood when there can be an input from Westminster and a positive input that helps communities right across the country. But in terms of what people can do, it's just don't be so doom-laden about our future. This is a union that has served all 4 parts of the United Kingdom well for over 300 years, economically and politically. And too often I just hear the narrative from members of the party, but also media based here in London, commentariat, saying the fight is over, independence is inevitable. And it's not. I don't want the work I put in with thousands of others back in 2014 and the 3-year campaign up to that referendum to be a waste, because 2 million Scots said just 6 years ago, we want to stay part of the United Kingdom. We were given a democratic decision, and the democratic mandate was to remain part of the UK. So don't now do the SNP's work for them and the separatists' work for them by talking down what we can get from and what we deliver through the union.
Yeah, but I suppose you could argue. I mean, because the SNP came back on your speech and said, well, look, it's a settled will of the Scottish people to be independent. But let me just give you an example of where it's tricky to know what to do. Right. So on the one hand, we're arguing as Conservatives, we've had a referendum. It's a once in a generation thing. We don't need to have another one straight away. And there's a resonance for that, as far as I understand it, and you can correct me, but there is a resonance to that message in Scotland, and it's one of the reasons why it's one of your messages. But what Scottish people don't want is for English people to tell them they can't have a referendum. So sometimes you get to feel, I don't know what the right thing to say is, so maybe I shouldn't say anything at all.
Well, I mean, that form of apathy does, again, work against the message that the union brings everyone together. It's working together. It's 4 nations combining, as we've seen through this pandemic. You can have different responses from a public health point of view in all 4 parts of the UK, but you can also have the economic response from the UK government delivering in all parts of the country. So I get that some people sometimes think it's maybe risky to get involved in this debate. And if they go on social media, by God, they get shouted down for it. How dare anyone have an opinion? I get told I can't have an opinion as a Conservative in Scotland, despite being a patriotic Scot and Brit. So I think it's to give people a bit more confidence as well that, we can all come together in this fight, and don't let the narrative that the rest of the UK doesn't care if our union breaks up and Scotland separates and goes it alone. Yes, we do. And as Conservative and Unionists, we care absolutely about the future of our union.
So a core to keeping the union together and to winning any referendum, actually, is to say, look, if you make this change, it represents risky change. Don't go down the route of risky change. And there are some very powerful arguments. Hopefully you'll rehearse some to prevent the separation from taking place from the economic interest of Scotland. But some other people say, we shouldn't be stressing those things. What we should be doing is making the positive case for the union. That sounds right, because who doesn't want to make the positive case? But maybe a bit more of a ruthless political brain would say it wouldn't work. So where are you on this balance between the ruthless pragmatism that driving a wedge between practicality and nationalism is critical to winning the election, and the kind of emotional pull we all have to making a positive case for the relationship?
Well, it absolutely has to be both. You don't win the argument alone with just the head. You also need the heart. And I think sometimes, we've forgotten that, and we continually make the case with the GERS figures, for example, this year. The amount of money the Scottish government spent was in deficit in terms of what it took in to more than the annual running cost of the NHS in Scotland. So there are some real clear figures we can use about what it would mean for public services, for example, what would have to be cut, what would have to be lost if we were to separate from the rest of the United Kingdom. We've still got no answer. Would we be using a different currency from the rest of the UK? What would it mean about a border between Scotland and England? And those are all hard points that we can put to the SNP, and they haven't answered in the 6 years since the last referendum and couldn't answer in 2014. But we also need to use that emotional argument, and it's both. It's both the head and the heart, convincing people that we are far better united as four nations than we were to separate one of those nations and go it alone.
And do you think that it's important to the union argument that people in Scotland feel that England cares about the union?
Yeah, and that's the point I was making. What would the United Kingdom look like without Scotland? And I made the point. The Union flag needs Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. So everything we look to for our identity is based on being a union of four nations working together and having worked together for over 300 years.
Okay, so what I think has spooked a lot of people, and why you get this feeling that the jig is up, isn't really the opinion polls. It is the kind of the way that Nicola Sturgeon has been able, who looks to a traditional Conservative eye to be quite an unattractive candidate in some ways, right? A candidate who in an English election would be kind of weak, and yet she's been incredibly successful. She's clearly an effective political communicator, so I suppose first of all, is that assessment one that you think Scottish people do share? And if they do, what do you think her weaknesses and the SNP's weaknesses are?
So I think she's an effective communicator, and you can see that. But in terms of areas where the SNP have not performed, you've got to look at the services people rely on day in, day out. The SNP have been in charge in Scotland for 13 years now, over 13 years. They've had full control over education. When they came to power, education in Scotland was still world-leading, world-renowned, and now it's slipped down the international rankings. At the same time, Nicola Sturgeon pledged education would be her top priority. We've seen the economy stagnating in Scotland, where other parts of the UK before this pandemic were progressing. We've seen in the programme for government, for example, that the SNP brought forward just last month, that it didn't mention small businesses once. It didn't have space in their programme for government for an education bill, which they previously promised and then dropped, but it did have space for another bill on independence. So they've prioritise separation over schools. The economy needs support from the government. In my first 30 days as leader, I said I would bring forward a jobs and economy paper, which I did. And I was putting forward ideas that the SNP and the Scottish Government could immediately take on board to help businesses, to help employees and help communities. And they haven't concentrated on that. They've once again concentrated on independence. So it's really, I think, the area we need to focus on is what they haven't delivered on in Scotland and all the powers they do have that they haven't used.
Talk to me about Richard Leonard.
That's it. That's Richard Leonard. It's blank. You know, he's been in charge now for, 3 years, and I don't think many people could really say what he has done for the Labour Party or what he's done for Scottish politics. And, you know, for many traditional Labour supporters, that's very difficult for them because they have seen the party once great, dominating Scottish politics, both at Westminster and then when the Scottish Parliament was re-established in 1999. They were the driving force. Donald Dewar as the First Minister, who took over the reins of devolved Scotland at a time when we needed senior and serious politicians. And now they look at the Labour Party and what Richard Leonard is doing or isn't doing and just see no future for them. And that's why I also made the point in my speech that the Scottish Conservatives are now the strongest pro-union party in Scotland. We've got the strength right across the country. And back in 2016, if we were speaking at this time in 2015, ahead of the last Scottish Parliament elections, people were saying the SNP have got a majority, they're on course to retain their majority. The Scottish Conservatives are in third place, and then look what happened. Nicola Sturgeon lost the SNP majority, and the Conservatives overtook Scottish Labour and more than doubled our representation up to 31 MSPs. So, and since then, it's been a continual decline for Scottish Labour. And I think a lot of natural Labour supporters are looking to the Conservatives, and they came across to us in 16, 17, and in 19 to an extent. And they are looking for a home that has strong values and a strong set of policies to take the country forward, but they know will be strong defenders of the union as well.
But just sort of playing devil's advocate, maybe this revival of the Conservative Party in Scotland, however gratifying it may be for us, is a bit of a disaster for the union. The one thing that we really need is for the Labour Party to revive in Scotland. That would be the contrarian's position, obviously a bracing thing to discuss at a Conservative conference. But if the Labour Party doesn't win back some of its vote from Scottish nationalists, and if it polarises between left and right, with all the left going with a non-union vote, isn't that actually part of the problem, not part of the solution?
Well, it was the solution, though, in 2016 that the Scottish Conservatives proved to be the brake on the SNP and their ambitions for a second independence referendum. As I say, Nicola went into that election in 2016 with a majority, and she came out of it without one, and she had to put a brake on her plans because the Conservatives came from third up to second as the main opposition and took the majority away from the SNP. So I think if people are looking for that pro-union message, that strong unionist cause and case being made, they can only see that now being made by the Scottish Conservatives.
Do you think that part of the solution might be some sort of big constitutional settlement? So one or two people have said to me, what we really need to do, senior Conservatives have said this to me, what we really need to do is find a way of rejigging Parliament so we have a federal chamber and all that. Is that on your, and obviously if Scottish Conservatives believe that, I think the whole of the party would have to listen to that with great respect. Is that your view?
What we've seen from this government and previous Conservative governments have been delivering more powers than ever before to the Scottish Parliament. And actually the Scottish Parliament is one of the most powerful devolved parliaments anywhere in the world. In the Internal Market Bill, there's over 100 extra powers going from Europe to Westminster, Westminster to Holyrood. So actually what we're seeing from successive governments is more powers going from Westminster to Holyrood. What I find very disappointing is when the SNP, as the Scottish Government, call for greater powers over things and they get them, for example, on social security, they hand them right back to Westminster and say, we're not ready to take these on yet. We can't do what we'd intended to do. So these people that call for more powers powers to the Scottish Parliament are ignoring the fact that there have been a considerable transfer of powers already, and when some key powers are devolved to Holyrood, they get sent back to Westminster by the SNP Scottish Government.
So, what about the thought that because of the Brexit debate, the Conservative government has kind of changed its complexion, and from Theresa May more towards what Boris Johnson thinks, that as the Conservative government has done that, it's become less attractive to Scottish voters, and that poses a problem for you in the elections and for the referendum. How would you respond to that suggestion?
Well, we're a unique party in Scotland. The Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party are, part of the wider Conservative Party, but we have our own separate set of policies. And I think what people will already have seen from the paper I brought forward on education and schooling are some very unique policies in there that wouldn't match what the rest of the UK party would bring forward or have in the past taken forward. So I would say to people to look at us as the Scottish Party, the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party is on the ballot next year. I'm the leader of the party up in Scotland, and I'll take forward the policy and the team that I think can deliver right across Scotland. Another point I would say is I think far too often our politics in Scotland has become very central belt centric. And I previously represented the Highlands and Islands. I'm hoping to represent that region again. And I think it's healthy that our politicians come from more than just the central belt of Scotland, but a wider perspective on what we can deliver in the north, the south, the east and the west.
He's the Prime Minister's famously a very capable campaigner, and has been able to bring surprising people over to the Conservatives at different parts and different times of his career. Does he play in Scotland?
Well, his approval ratings would suggest he's got an uphill challenge to convince more and more Scots. But, he is a proud unionist. He believes in the strength of the four nations of the United Kingdom, and his government, whether it's through the City and Growth Region deals that's now covered right across every part of Scotland, or through the £6.5 billion they've delivered to Scotland to help us get through the COVID pandemic. This current UK government, led by the Prime Minister, are continuing to work hard for the whole of the country, levelling up right across the United Kingdom. That includes in Scotland, and he's determined to see that continue going forward.
What about the latest controversy, which is the Internal Markets Bill, which some Conservatives don't support? I mean, I have to admit, I'm one of those people. And it might have particular problems for Scotland?
Well, I said at the time when it came to the second reading that I approved it at second reading because I thought it should go into committee stage to be improved, and there were areas where I thought it could be improved. And I think the government's own amendments that they brought forward certainly addressed some of the concerns that were held within the Conservative parliamentary group of MPs. But I also absolutely believe the Internal Market Bill is fundamental to ensuring that businesses can continue to trade right across the United Kingdom. And the 545,000 jobs that the Fraser of Allender Institute says relies on the smooth trade between the four nations through the internal market. And I think when we get down to this is about jobs, it's about the economy, and it's about ensuring that businesses in Murray can continue to Baxter's, Walker's, all these global businesses can continue to trade right around the UK as they have previously done before. And they need to have that certainty, and they get that through the Internal Market Bill.
Can you, do you think, put to use for the Scottish referendum, if we ever have one, this idea that Brexit was proved incredibly difficult, tricky, and the politics was completely subsumed by it? People got thoroughly fed up with it. Is that an argument that can be put at all in terms of its analogy with Scotland? And secondly, if it can be put, can it be put by Conservatives, considering that obviously the Conservative Party has been in government through that period?
Well, there's a lot of caveats to this. If I start off by saying I don't think we should be having that argument, I do think, we settled the question for a generation back in 2014. I would also say, 1 million people in Scotland voted for Brexit. My own Murray constituency came closer than any other part of Scotland to vote to leave. Just 122 votes separated leave and remain. So in areas like Murray, there's a large number of people that voted to leave the European Union. But I think anyone looking at it objectively would look at the challenges that this government and the previous government have faced in leaving the European Union, a union we'd only been part of for 40 or so years, compared to what the challenges would be if the SNP got their way and we were to separate from the rest of the UK, a union that I've said a few times this evening we've been part of for over 300 years.
Yeah, why do you think there has been the nationalists have been able to establish the base that they had? What do you hold responsible for that rising tide of nationalism? What is the itch that Scottish people are trying to scratch?
Well, I think there has been a constant campaign by the SNP and those who believe in independence since 2014. And I think some of us on the other side of the argument felt that we had convinced a majority of Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom. And the Edinburgh Agreement said the referendum in 2014 would be a gold standard and both sides would accept the result. And maybe we didn't do enough in that period, the last 6 years, to continue to promote a positive message about the Union, while at the same time the SNP and those who support independence never accepted the result, and they have continued to use every vehicle possible to champion their cause to separate Scotland from the rest of the UK.
Okay, well let's we've had some questions which have been passed to me, and I've got them here. So let me try and take you through some of the audience questions. And one or two I've got names for, but others are without names. Let me start with this one. Do you see the SNP gradually tiptoeing, I think is the right word, tiptoeing towards unilateralism with regard to the referendum and independence? And can this get worse if they get over 50% of the vote share?
Well, I mean, there have been arguments, and I think the SNP either have a motion to their next conference, or there are plans to bring forward, what would happen if the UK government don't agree to a Section 30 order to grant a second independence referendum. And again, I think both that and, speculating if the SNP were to get over 50% of the vote, what would that mean for another independence referendum? Once again, plays into their narrative. It gets us totally away from discussing and debating and critically looking at their record in government over the last 13 years, and gets them onto an easier topic for nationalists, which is separation. So I want to hold Nicola Sturgeon to account, hold the Scottish Government to account, and ask them, why is education no longer their number one priority? Why do they prioritise separation over schools? These are the issues that people, again going back to the opinion polls, say that they want us to focus on. They want us and this next Parliament that will be elected, 129 MSPs for the next 5 years, to focus on these issues rather than a constitutional battle that we've already fought.
Okay, so when do you think the SNP is using the devolved powers it has on education to steer the views of Scottish youth?
So, I mean, there have been a number of newspaper articles, discussions about changing the curriculum, and a curriculum that looks more about Scottish history than wider UK and British history. I found the young people of Scotland in 2014 the most engaged in the referendum and the discussions we had. The best questions and the most challenging questions came from young people, and they want to learn about the history of their country, which is both Scotland and the UK and Great Britain. And I think it's healthy that they do that, and I trust our teachers and our young people to get to the bottom of any of these key issues, however they're taught. Does
Scotland's experience with letting votes at 16 happen suggest to you that the rest of us should pick it up in Westminster?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, at 16, people are forming very solid opinions, but they are doing it in a reasoned way. And as I say, during that referendum, the campaign and the discussions we had with young people on the street stalls, on the doors, and in schools were some of the best discussions, the most challenging to answer because they really got into the detail of things, and it's their future that they're looking forward to. And I think, they're part of the franchise now in Scotland, and that was a good thing.
So, looking back at the examples of World War One and the Great Depression, is there merit in 2021 in the three unionist parties forming a united front?
But what we've seen from the unionist parties, and we've briefly spoken about Labour and how far back they've fallen in Scotland, and the Liberal Democrats are now, I think, down to 5 MSPs out of the 129. The clear message is that if people want to unite behind a strong unionist candidate, that candidate will be the Scottish Conservative and Unionist candidate, and the party that can put a brake on Nicola Sturgeon's ambitions for another referendum to separate Scotland are the Scottish Conservative and Unionists. So yes, there should be an alliance behind the strongest party, and at the last election and clearly now going forward, that strongest party is the Scottish Conservatives.
Can you let the rest of us in on this, because this is a question for me? But so I met Jack. I came out to Glasgow, gave a speech in the Jewish community. I loved Jackson. I thought he was great. So what happened there?
Jackson just,
a very sophisticated political question.
Yeah, and I like Jackson as well. I backed him in both his leadership campaigns, and I think it's just a measure of a man that has been so involved in the Conservative and Unionist Party for 40 years that he reflected on his own performance since fully becoming leader, because obviously he'd been interim leader. Paul Ruth was off on maternity leave and deputy leader before that. But he just reflected and thought he had not taken the party to where he wanted the party to be. And ahead of a really important election, he felt over the summer that if he was going to do something about it, that was the right time. And like I say, I think there will be Labour people potentially looking at this, or looking at the example with this within the Conservatives, and wish their own leadership maybe took a similar critical eye over their performance, and they might not be in the position they currently are.
But the problem that Labour's got is if Keir Starmer did try and put pressure on Labour to remove Richard Leonard, wouldn't he create this Westminster problem for anybody who got elected in place?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily just have to come from Keir Starmer. We saw, I think now, 4 front bench spokespeople for the Labour Party resign their positions in Holyrood because they wanted a change of leadership. But Richard Leonard has clung on, and I think for many Labour supporters, that wasn't the right choice. They wanted to see a change in leadership, and now that Richard Leonard remains in place ahead of the Scottish Parliament elections, they're looking for an alternative party that will stand up for them, and particularly on the union, they're looking to the Scottish Conservatives to do that.
So here's another question. Once our UK Brexit future is fully decided at the end of the year, do you think the realities of an independent Scotland will see votes move away from the SNP?
Well, we said, earlier, the difficulties in delivering the referendum result for Brexit and leaving the European Union are stark in contrast to what it would be should they ever be a decision to leave the Union of the United Kingdom. But I do think there are lots of opportunities we will see in Scotland going forward. Our fishing communities, when we leave the hated common fisheries policy, is a benefit to my Murray seat, the north of Scotland, and it's a totemic issue in Scotland. When we get the Shared Prosperity Fund up and running, so there's been funding that we've sent to the European Union to come back to the United Kingdom to be spent in projects here. Let's see that money being spent directly from the UK government in projects in Scotland. These are all benefits that people will be able to look at and see as we go forward beyond the 1st of January next year.
Can I just press you a little bit on the fishing? Do you think that there's a deal that we can do there? Because almost any deal, isn't it bound to involve fishing rights to some extent being traded in order to get a deal?
Well, I think what we've seen from the Prime Minister, and even just in his Andrew Marr interview yesterday on Sunday, was how important he places fishing in his negotiations with the European Union, and the fact that we're still in these tense negotiations shows that the UK government have a strong position on this, and that it is a key area for both the Prime Minister and the whole UK government. But ultimately, from the 1st of January, we will leave the Common Fisheries Policy, which has held back that industry and many of the communities that thrive from it prior to our entry into the European Union, for far too long. And ultimately, I know many fishermen will be glad just to see us out the Common Fisheries Policy.
Should the rest of the party, asks Councillor Fifield, should the rest of the party follow Scotland's example and make fuller use of Conservative and Unionist on the ballot paper and campaigning?
Yeah, well, I think so. And, we are all proud unionists, or we should be. And that's what I was saying again to people in my conference speech. The full title of our party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. And if you believe in the strength of the union and strengthening the union, you should all get right behind that message. And those who do look at themselves in the mirror, as I was asking them to do, and consider, are they defeatism in their attitude over the union? Are they not doing enough to promote what our four nations do together? Then perhaps they're in the wrong party, because our party is the one that can stand up for the union at every opportunity.
What is in your view, what is it that the SNP and nationalists want to gain out of independence? Is it a purely cultural thing, or are there some concrete things, for example, some sort of radically different foreign policy that the Scottish independent nation would actually do? So what is the balance there between kind of concrete things and an emotional feeling?
Well, it's very difficult for me to answer. Obviously, the Scottish National Party and the Green Party, who are another nationalist party in Scotland, are anti-Trident, for example. So you could suggest it's on defence policy. That's an area of significant difference. But what we've seen with both the White Paper and recently the Andrew Wilson report is there are still many elements of what, despite the SNP having this as their ambition and their raison d'etre throughout their entire time as a political party, there are still so many areas where they can't answer basic questions about what an independent Scotland would mean for individuals, for families, for businesses and communities. And that is quite stark, given how long they have campaigned for separation and how it's their ultimate policy that they still cannot tell us basic answers about what it would mean for us and our everyday lives in Scotland. So,
in some ways, there's an analogy with the Brexit campaign. I mean, obviously, there are lots of people on this call who I'm sure were supporters of both of Brexit and of unionism. So they're not the same thing, and the arguments are different because Europe shouldn't be a nation state. But listen, what are using some of the analogies, what are the mistakes made by Remain in the referendum that a Stronger Together campaign might avoid in a future referendum, were we to have one, or indeed even before a referendum? Let's in making the case for it.
Yeah, I think potentially the Remain camp in 2016 didn't learn the lessons so much from 2014. It did get very negative. A lot of the arguments were about, well, what you couldn't do if we leave the European Union, and we need to provide a positive argument for staying in. And I don't think we've done enough of that positivity, of delivering that positive message about what the union currently does and what it can continue to do going forward. And yeah, I think that would probably be, on reflection, an area where the Remain camp could have done more to speak of the benefits of remaining, and we must do now, reiterate time and time again the benefits that we all get from being part of the Union of the United Kingdom.
What about this? When the government does talk about, this is one of the questions that have been sent in, when the government talks of levelling up, how does that play in Scotland? Has that been a good message? Has it resonated at all? Is it thought to be just about the north of England?
Well, I wouldn't say it's been thought to be just about the north of England, but we've got to match our words with action. And that's why the infrastructure plan that was announced earlier on at conference is one that we can see delivering right into Scotland and throughout Scotland. And I think that is a really positive message. Again, going back to my document that I released within my first 30 days, I was speaking about better connectivity between Glasgow and Edinburgh, and also Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Inverness. So we are connecting our major cities far better with the plans I was bringing forward and the proposals for infrastructure investment, but also within communities as well, because there's an awful lot more we can be doing about better connectivity right across Scotland.
Okay, so here's another one. We're nearing our limit, unfortunately, but will the dynamics of Scottish independence change after Brexit?
Well, my view is we took a decision in 2014 to remain part of the United Kingdom. That was a decision that was put to the people. Brexit was on the horizon then. In fact, it was mentioned in the SNP's white paper. If you vote to remain part of the UK could vote to leave the European Union. So the suggestion that people weren't aware of that when they went into the polling stations in 2014 is not correct. I think it goes back to the arguments or the points we've been making throughout this, that we need to continue to make the strong case for the union, not looking at other aspects about whether it's Brexit, whether it's UK government policy, whether it's Scottish government policy, but just looking at the wider benefits of remaining part of the United Kingdom.
Good. I'm sorry that there are little notification bings, but you'll be pleased to know that my father-in-law's radiators are now working.
I'm relieved.
Good. I thought you would be. Okay, let's just do one last question, which is about a little goes back to the question about how you put this case in a referendum. Do you think there's more that we can do to put to Scottish voters, or you can do to put Scottish voters, the cost of disentangling the UK? One of the things that has been proposed, I've seen it proposed, is that what we ought to do is start a discussion now with the Scottish government about what they mean by an independent Scotland. Now, the danger of that, of course, is you create a kind of reality of it, but the advantage is you show all the difficulties. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, I agree with your argument that it then would allow the SNP to suggest, as I was saying, we must stop them doing that. Independence is inevitable, and they would argue, well, if parties around the country are discussing what an independent Scotland would look like, they've given up on the fight for the union, and they're now accepting that this is going to happen. And I think that would be absolutely the wrong message, particularly for those 2 million Scots who just 6 years ago voted to stay part of the United Kingdom. But let's remember that there has been this prospectus before. The SNP launched a white paper ahead of the 2014 referendum, which was saying this is how Scotland would look if you vote to leave the rest of the UK. And that was based on oil at $100 a barrel. Oil has never been $100 a barrel since that paper was published. And look at what it's been during this pandemic and at the early stages of that. It didn't go into any details on the currency. There were issues, many issues throughout that document that didn't bear scrutiny. So people only have to look back at that, which the SNP said would answer everyone's questions. It didn't. It raised even more questions, and many questions that remain unanswered. So, to be very clear to your point, I don't think that would be the right approach to take, because the Nationalists would use this as an example of furthering their cause for separation. And when they have tried to do it themselves in the past, they remain unable to give details on key issues that people look to if they were to take such a huge decision. Okay.
Well, Douglas, I know that you've got an important political business that has to be settled at 7, so we agree we finished just ahead. And
apologies about that. Yeah.
No, that's totally fine. You've given us plenty of your time, and we've all had a chance to ask questions. I have, and our audience has. We're really grateful. Thank you very much for those answers, and I think a lot clearer about the political position. Certainly, I am in Scotland. I've really enjoyed it, and I know our guests have as well. Thank you very much indeed, Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much. Thanks.